I never thought I would end up in a legal battle with my own neighborhood, but here I was, standing in my 20-acre forest, watching contractors string power lines through my property like they owned the place. My name is James Everhart, and I had bought this beautiful piece of land just outside Asheville, North Carolina 3 years ago. The property was mostly forested, with a modest cabin I had built myself near the front of the lot. The back 18 acres were pure wilderness, dense with oak, maple, and pine trees that had been growing for decades. It was my sanctuary, my escape from the corporate world I had left behind when I sold my software company. I was 42 years old and had finally achieved what I had always wanted: peace and quiet. That peace shattered on a Tuesday morning in early March when I heard chainsaws roaring through my forest. I grabbed my jacket and boots and hiked back through the trails I had carefully maintained. What I found made my blood boil. A crew of 6 men were cutting down my trees, creating a 30-foot wide corridor straight through the heart of my property. Massive spools of electrical cable sat on flatbed trucks that had somehow made it onto my land, and wooden utility poles lay stacked like matchsticks waiting to be erected. "Hey!" I shouted over the noise of the saws. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" A burly man in a hard hat shut off his chainsaw and walked over to me. "We are running a power line through here. Should be done in about 2 weeks." "This is my property," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Who authorized this?" He pulled out a crumpled work order from his pocket. "Says here the Meadowbrook Hills HOA approved it. We got all the permits we need." Meadowbrook Hills was the neighborhood association that technically governed my area, though my property was on the very edge of their jurisdiction. When I had bought the land, I had specifically checked that the forested portion was outside the main HOA restrictions. The cabin and the front 2 acres fell under their rules, which I had begrudgingly accepted, but the forest was supposed to be mine to do with as I pleased. "Let me see that," I said, snatching the paper from his hand. Sure enough, it showed an approval from Brenda Patterson, the HOA president, dated 2 weeks prior. The document claimed there was an existing utility easement across my property that gave them the right to install infrastructure. I had never seen any easement in my property documents, and I had gone through them with a fine-tooth comb when I purchased the land. "Stop working," I ordered, "right now, until I can verify this easement actually exists." The contractor shook his head. "We got a schedule to keep, buddy. We are already behind on this job. If you got a problem, take it up with your HOA." "I am taking it up with you," I said firmly. "This is my land and you are trespassing. If you do not stop immediately, I'm calling the sheriff." He sighed and pulled out his phone, walking away to make a call. I could hear him talking to someone, probably a supervisor. After a few minutes, he came back looking annoyed. "Fine, we will hold off for 24 hours, but if you do not get this sorted out by tomorrow morning, we are back to work whether you like it or not." The crew packed up their tools and left, their trucks tearing up the forest floor as they rumbled back toward the main road. I stood there surveying the damage they had already done. At least a dozen mature trees had been felled, their stumps jagged and raw. The smell of fresh-cut wood filled the air, and sawdust covered everything like yellow snow. I pulled out my phone and called the HOA office. A cheerful voice answered on the 3rd ring. "Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association. This is Kimberly speaking. How may I help you?" "I need to speak with Brenda Patterson immediately," I said. "May I ask what this is regarding?" "She just authorized contractors to destroy my property without my permission, so yes, it is urgent." There was a pause. "Please hold." Elevator music played for what felt like an eternity before a sharp nasal voice came on the line. "This is Brenda Patterson. I understand you are upset about the utility work, Mr. Everhart." Upset? I could not believe her tone. "Your contractors just cut down a dozen of my trees and claim they have an easement to run power lines through my forest. An easement I have never heard of and certainly never agreed to." "The easement predates your ownership," Brenda said smoothly. "It was established in 1987 when this neighborhood was first developed. All properties in Meadowbrook Hills are subject to it." "My forest is not part of the main neighborhood development," I countered, "and I want to see documentation of this easement, right now." "HOA documents are available for review during business hours at our office. We are open Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. It is 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. I will be there in 30 minutes. I hung up before she could respond and headed back to my cabin to grab my truck keys and the folder containing all my property documents. The drive to the HOA office took 20 minutes, located in a strip mall near the main entrance of Meadowbrook Hills. The neighborhood was one of those planned communities that had sprung up in the early 2000s, with cookie-cutter houses on small lots, all painted in approved colors with approved landscaping. My property had been annexed into their jurisdiction a few years after I bought it, through some county rezoning that I had not paid enough attention to at the time. The HOA office was small and sterile, with beige walls covered in notices about community rules and upcoming events. A young woman sat at the front desk, presumably Kimberly from the phone. "I am here to see Brenda Patterson," I said. "Do you have an appointment?" "She's expecting me, James Everhart." Kimberly picked up her phone and murmured something, then nodded toward a hallway. "Second door on the right." Brenda Patterson's office was exactly what I expected. Everything was organized to an obsessive degree, with labeled file boxes stacked perfectly on shelves and not a single paper out of place on her desk. Brenda herself was a thin woman in her early 50s with short blonde hair styled in an aggressive bob. She wore a pantsuit that looked expensive and glasses on a chain around her neck. "Mr. Everhart," she said, without getting up or offering to shake hands. "Please sit." I remained standing. "Show me the easement." She made a show of sighing before pulling out a file from her desk drawer. Inside was a yellowed document that looked like it had been photocopied multiple times. She slid it across the desk toward me. The document was titled Utility Easement Agreement and dated August 1987. It described a 20-foot wide corridor running through several properties in what was then an undeveloped area. My land was referenced by an old parcel number, but the description was vague at best. More importantly, I noticed something odd. "This easement was for telephone lines," I said, pointing to the text, "not electrical power." "Utility easements cover all utilities," Brenda said dismissively. "Phone, electric, cable, whatever is needed." "That is not what this says. This specifically mentions telephone service infrastructure." "The HOA board has determined that the language is broad enough to cover our current needs." "Your current needs?" I set the paper down. "What exactly are you running power to?" For the first time, Brenda looked slightly uncomfortable. "The HOA is developing a community recreation area on the eastern boundary of the neighborhood. We need to bring power to the site for the facilities." "And you decided to run it through my forest instead of along the road?" "The road route would cost an additional $40,000. The HOA budget does not allow for such extravagance when there's a perfectly good easement available." I leaned forward, placing my hands on her desk. "Here is what is going to happen. I'm going to take this document to a real estate attorney and have them review it. If they determine that you do not have the right to run power lines through my property, those contractors do not come back. Understood?" Brenda's eyes narrowed. "The HOA has legal authority to enforce easements, Mr. Everhart. If you interfere with necessary infrastructure improvements, we will fine you, place a lien on your property, and if necessary, take you to court. I suggest you accept reality and let the work proceed." I grabbed the document from her desk. "I am taking this to make copies." "That is HOA property. It is a legal document that affects my land. I have every right to a copy." I walked out of her office before she could argue further. The nearest FedEx office had a copy center, and I made 3 copies of the easement document along with all my property paperwork. Then I drove straight to the law office of Mitchell & Associates, the firm that had handled my property purchase. Unfortunately, the attorney who had worked on my closing had retired, but a younger associate named David Mitchell agreed to see me. David was in his early 30s, with the eager energy of someone still building his practice. He listened carefully as I explained the situation, then spent 20 minutes reviewing the documents I had brought. "This is interesting," he finally said. "The easement is real, but you are right that it specifically mentions telephone infrastructure. In 1987, there was a clear legal distinction between telephone and electrical utilities. They were regulated differently and required separate easements. So they cannot use it for power lines?" "Probably not, but it is not entirely clear-cut. The HOA could argue that modern interpretation of utility has evolved. However, I think you have a strong case, especially since the original easement was so specific about telephone service. He leaned back in his chair. There is another issue, too. Even if the easement technically allows for utilities, the scope of use matters. A telephone line requires minimal clearance and disruption. A power line corridor with the kind of clear-cutting you described goes well beyond the reasonable use contemplated in 1987. So what do? I will draft a cease and desist letter to the HOA and the contractor. That will buy us time to file a motion with the court for a declaratory judgment on the easement scope. It will probably take a few months to get a hearing, but it will prevent them from continuing work in the meantime. And if they ignore the cease and desist? David's expression turned serious. Then they are knowingly trespassing, and you would have grounds for a lawsuit seeking both injunctive relief and damages. I hired him on the spot and gave him a retainer. He promised to have the cease and desist letters sent out by the next morning via certified mail and email. I drove home feeling slightly better, though still angry about the destruction already done to my forest. When I got back to the cabin, I walked through the damaged area again, documenting everything with photos and video. The stumps of old growth trees lay scattered like broken teeth, and the forest floor was churned up into mud from the heavy equipment. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Brenda's smug attitude and her threats about fines and liens. The HOA had always been a nuisance with their endless rules about lawn height and mailbox colors. But this was different. This was a direct assault on the thing I valued most about my property. The next morning at 8, I heard trucks rumbling in the distance. I grabbed my phone and camera and headed back into the forest. Sure enough, the contractors were back, chainsaws roaring as they continued clearing trees. I ran up to the same foreman from yesterday. "I told you to stop. My attorney is sending a cease and desist letter." He turned off his saw. "My boss got a call from the HOA this morning. They said to proceed with the work. If you got a legal problem, that's between you and them. You are trespassing on private property. We got a work order based on a recorded easement. That is all we need." He turned the chainsaw back on and went back to cutting. I pulled out my phone and called the Buncombe County Sheriff's Department. The dispatcher said she would send a deputy out to assess the situation. While I waited, I filmed the contractors working, making sure to capture their company name on the trucks and their faces. Deputy Marcus Shaw arrived 40 minutes later. He was an older man with gray hair and the tired expression of someone who had seen it all. I explained the situation while showing him the easement document and my property deed. "This is a civil matter," he said after reviewing everything. "I cannot force them to leave based on a dispute over an easement. You need to go through the courts." "But they are destroying my property right now," I protested. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Everhart, but unless you have a court order saying they cannot be here, my hands are tied. The easement document gives them at least a colorable claim of right to be on the property, even if you dispute its validity." After the deputy left, I called David Mitchell and told him what was happening. He was furious. "That HOA is playing with fire," he said. "Keep documenting everything, every tree they cut, every bit of damage. When we get in front of a judge, that evidence will matter." "How long until you can get an emergency injunction?" "I'm working on it now. The problem is we need to schedule a hearing and the court is backed up. Earliest I can get is probably next week. They will have the entire power line installed by then. I know, do not do anything that could get you arrested, James. I know you are angry, but you need to let the legal process work." But watching the contractors destroy my forest day after day was torture. By Friday of that week, they had cleared a corridor nearly a quarter-mile long and had started digging holes for the utility poles. The noise was constant from dawn until dusk, and the pristine forest I had loved was becoming an industrial zone. The hearing for the temporary injunction was scheduled for the following Thursday. David filed a motion, accompanied by a thick brief arguing that the easement was invalid for electrical use, and that the scope of destruction exceeded any reasonable interpretation of the easement's terms. The HOA filed a response brief, arguing that they had full authority to proceed and that I was simply a disgruntled property owner trying to obstruct necessary community improvements. That Tuesday evening, I got a letter in my mailbox from the HOA. It was a notice of violation and fine. According to Brenda Patterson, I had failed to maintain proper lawn height in front of my cabin and had parked my truck in an unapproved location. The fine was $500, with an additional $50 per day if not corrected immediately. The petty retaliation was obvious. My lawn was maybe half an inch longer than their absurd 3-inch maximum, and my truck was parked exactly where it had been for 3 years without complaint. I crumpled the letter and threw it in the trash. And the hearing on Thursday was held at the Buncombe County Courthouse in downtown Asheville. David and I arrived early and waited in a conference room while other cases were heard. Finally, around 2 in the afternoon, we were called in. Judge Carol Henderson was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who had a reputation for not tolerating games from either side. Brenda Patterson was there with the HOA's attorney, a slick-looking man named Richard Vance who wore an expensive suit and had the air of someone used to winning. David presented our case clearly and methodically, walking through the specific language of the 1987 easement and showing photos of the destruction that had been done to my property. He argued that even if the easement could be stretched to cover electrical lines, the scope of clearing and disruption went far beyond what was contemplated or reasonable. Vance countered that utility easements were inherently broad, that modern power lines were a natural evolution of telecommunications infrastructure, and that the HOA had full authority to make infrastructure decisions for the community's benefit. He also argued that I had waited too long to object, implying that my acquiescence to the initial work somehow waived my rights. Judge Henderson listened to both sides, asked several pointed questions about the specific wording of the easement, and then took a brief recess to review the documents. When she returned, she looked directly at Vance. "Counselor, I have read this easement 3 times now, and nowhere does it mention electrical power. It specifically refers to telephone service infrastructure. Unless you can show me case law that directly supports converting a telephone easement into an electrical easement, I am inclined to grant the injunction." Vance scrambled through his papers. "Your Honor, the principle of technological evolution in utility easements is well established. Just as a right-of-way for horse-drawn carriages evolved to include automobiles, utility easements must be interpreted in light of modern needs." "That is a creative argument," Judge Henderson said dryly. "But telephone and electrical service were distinct utilities with distinct regulatory frameworks in 1987. They still are today. If the HOA wanted an easement for electrical service, they should have obtained one specifically for that purpose." She turned to David. "I am granting your motion for a temporary injunction. All work on the power line project must cease immediately pending a full trial on the merits of the easement dispute. I am also ordering the HOA to restore the property to its original condition as much as reasonably possible." I wanted to cheer, but David had warned me to stay quiet and professional in court. Brenda's face had turned red, and she was whispering urgently to Vance. As we left the courtroom, Vance caught up with us in the hallway. "My client is prepared to offer compensation for the use of the easement," he said. $15,000 for a permanent electrical easement along the existing corridor." "Not interested," I said immediately. $25,000. "My forest is not for sale at any price. Tell your client to run their power line along the road like they should have done in the first place." Vance's professional demeanor cracked slightly. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Everhart. The HOA has considerable resources and will pursue this matter to the fullest extent of the law. Fighting us will cost you far more than $25,000 in legal fees." "Then I guess I will see you at trial," I said, and walked away. Over the next few weeks, I waited for the HOA to comply with the judge's order to restore my property. Nothing happened. The cleared corridor remained, and the utility poles that had already been erected stayed in place. I documented the non-compliance, and David filed a motion for contempt. Meanwhile, the HOA ramped up their harassment campaign. I got another violation notice for leaving my trash cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours after collection day. Then another for having a firewood stack that exceeded approved height limits. Then one claiming my cabin's exterior paint was fading and needed to be refreshed. Each notice came with a $500 fine. I ignored them all. David advised me that the fines were likely unenforceable given the ongoing legal dispute, and that the HOA was clearly retaliating against me for challenging their authority. The contempt hearing was scheduled for mid-May. This time, Judge Henderson was clearly annoyed when Vance tried to argue that restoration was impossible because the trees were already cut. Your client was ordered to restore the property as much as reasonably possible, the judge said sharply. That includes removing the utility poles, filling in the holes, replanting trees, and seeding the cleared areas with native vegetation. The fact that mature trees cannot be replaced overnight does not excuse your client from attempting restoration. Your Honor, the cost of such restoration would be prohibitive, Vance protested. We are talking about potentially $100,000 or more. Then your client should have thought about that before proceeding with work that was subject to a legal dispute. I am holding the HOA in contempt and ordering them to begin restoration within 30 days or face daily fines of $1,000. Brenda looked like she was about to explode. As we left the courthouse, she actually followed me into the parking lot. You are destroying this community, she shouted. That recreation area would have benefited everyone in Meadowbrook Hills, and you are blocking it because of your selfish obsession with a bunch of trees. You destroyed my property without permission, I said calmly. Actions have consequences, Brenda. We will get that power line built one way or another, and when we do, I will make sure you are forced out of this neighborhood. You do not belong here. I got in my truck and drove away, leaving her seething in the parking lot. But Brenda was not done. A week later, I discovered that the HOA had filed liens against my property for all the alleged violation fines, totaling over $15,000. They had also sent a formal notice that if the fines were not paid within 30 days, they would begin foreclosure proceedings. David was livid when I showed him the documents. This is absolutely retaliation, and it is going to backfire on them spectacularly. We are amending our lawsuit to include claims for harassment, abuse of process, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The full trial on the easement dispute was set for late August. In the meantime, the HOA made no effort to comply with the restoration order, and the daily contempt fines piled up. David informed me that the HOA owed over $60,000 in contempt fines and counting, but they seemed determined to outlast me. Then, something unexpected happened. I got a call from a man named Richard Torres, who lived in Meadowbrook Hills. He had heard about my legal battle through the neighborhood grapevine and wanted to meet with me. We met at a coffee shop in Asheville. Richard was in his 40s, a software engineer who worked remotely. He seemed nervous but determined. I need to tell you something about Brenda Patterson and the recreation area project, he said once we sat down. I'm on the HOA, Architectural Review Committee, and I have seen things that do not add up. What kind of things? The recreation area is supposed to be a community pool and playground, right? But the budget numbers do not make sense. Brenda keeps saying there is no money to run the power line along the road, but we approved a recreation area budget of $600,000. Running the line along the road would only add $40,000 to that. It does not make sense to destroy your property and fight this expensive legal battle to save that amount. So what do you think is really going on? Richard pulled out a folder. I did some digging. The land for the recreation area is being sold to the HOA by a development company called Clearwater Properties, LLC. I looked up the LLC registration, and guess who the registered agent is? Brenda Patterson? Her husband, Kevin Patterson. I think they own that land, and they're selling it to the HOA at an inflated price. The whole recreation area project might be a scheme to profit off the community. This was bigger than I had thought. Do you have proof? I have copies of the land sale contract and the LLC registration. I am not a lawyer, but it sure looks like a conflict of interest to me. I took the documents and contacted David immediately. He reviewed them with interest. If this is accurate, Brenda Patterson has been violating her fiduciary duty to the HOA, David said. She is required to disclose any personal financial interest in contracts the HOA enters into. If she did not disclose that her family owns the property being purchased, that is, potentially fraud. Can we use this in the trial? Absolutely. It goes directly to the HOA's motives and credibility. It also gives other homeowners grounds to challenge the entire recreation area project. David filed an amended complaint adding claims of fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. He also sent the documents to the North Carolina Attorney General's office, since HOAs in North Carolina were subject to state oversight. The response was swift. 2 weeks later, the Attorney General's office announced they were opening an investigation into the Meadowbrook Hills HOA's finances and governance. Brenda was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation, and an interim board was appointed to manage the HOA's affairs. The trial proceeded in late August as scheduled, but with Brenda's authority undermined and the Attorney General investigating, the HOA's legal position had collapsed. The new interim board members who attended the trial seemed far more interested in settling than fighting. On the third day of trial, after David had presented overwhelming evidence that the easement was invalid for electrical use and that the HOA had acted in bad faith, Vance approached us with a settlement offer. The HOA would abandon all claims to run power lines through my property, drop all violation fines and liens, and pay me $150,000 in damages and attorney fees. In exchange, I would agree not to pursue further claims against the HOA itself, though I would be free to pursue claims against Brenda personally if I chose. David recommended I accept. "You have won everything you wanted, James. The settlement gives you full vindication and compensation, and it ends the litigation. If you push for more, there is always some risk a jury could surprise us." I agreed to the settlement. Judge Henderson approved it and entered a final judgment in my favor. The power line project was officially dead, and my forest was legally protected from any future utility easements without my explicit written consent. But the story did not end there. The Attorney General's investigation continued, and by October, their findings were released publicly. Brenda Patterson had indeed been selling her family's land to the HOA at an inflated price, marking up the property value by over 40% compared to comparable sales. She had also been paying herself excessive management fees and had used HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, including a vacation to Hawaii that she had classified as a business trip. The AG's office filed civil charges against Brenda for fraud and embezzlement. The HOA filed its own lawsuit seeking to recover the misappropriated funds, and several homeowners, led by Richard Torres, filed a class action lawsuit against Brenda for breach of fiduciary duty. In January, facing potential criminal charges and overwhelming civil liability, Brenda agreed to a settlement. She would repay $300,000 to the HOA, resign from all positions, and accept a permanent ban from serving on any HOA board in North Carolina. The criminal investigation was dropped as part of the settlement, though Brenda had to admit wrongdoing in a public statement. Kevin Patterson quietly divorced Brenda 3 months later. The recreation area project was put on indefinite hold while the HOA rebuilt its finances. As for me, I used the settlement money to fund a massive restoration project on my forest. I hired an ecological restoration company to remove all traces of the power line corridor, plant hundreds of native trees and shrubs, and restore the natural hydrology of the area. It would take decades for the forest to fully recover, but at least the healing process had begun. I also used some of the money to install a series of cameras and motion sensors throughout my property. I was not taking any chances on future trespassing. The new HOA board, elected in the spring, took a dramatically different approach to governance. They implemented transparency measures, required all board members to disclose potential conflicts of interest, and established a homeowner grievance process. The endless petty violation notices stopped, and the HOA actually started focusing on legitimate community maintenance. Richard Torres was elected to the board and became a friend. He apologized on behalf of the community for what Brenda had put me through. "A lot of us knew she was power hungry," he said one day when he stopped by my cabin, "but we did not realize how far she had gone until you forced the issue. You did the whole neighborhood a favor." I appreciated the sentiment, but I knew that not everyone felt that way. There were still people in Meadowbrook Hills who thought I was the villain, the selfish property owner who had blocked a community amenity. They did not care about the fraud or the illegal power line or the destruction of my forest. They just wanted their pool and playground. But I had learned an important lesson through all of this. Standing up for your rights is never easy, and it often comes at a cost. If I had just accepted the HOA's actions and let them run the power line through my forest, my life would have been simpler in the short term. But I would have lost something irreplaceable, and Brenda's corruption would have continued unchecked. Sometimes you have to fight, even when it is hard, even when it costs you money and time and peace of mind. Because if you do not stand up for yourself, no one else will. One evening in late spring, I sat on my cabin porch watching the sun set through the trees. The forest was starting to show signs of recovery. Young trees were pushing up through the restored soil, and I had seen deer and wild turkeys returning to the area. The scars were still visible, but they were healing. I thought about everything that had happened over the past year. The anger and frustration I had felt seemed distant now, replaced by a sense of satisfaction that justice had been served. Brenda Patterson had learned that she could not simply bulldoze over people's rights for her own benefit. The HOA had learned that transparency and accountability mattered, and I had learned that my forest was worth fighting for. My phone buzzed with a text from David Mitchell. "Congratulations. Final settlement check cleared. It's officially over." I texted back a simple thank you and set my phone down. It was over, but the work of restoration was just beginning. I'd already ordered 200 more native tree saplings to plant in the fall, and I was planning to create a small wetland area where some of the drainage had been disrupted. The forest would recover. It might take 20 or 30 years to fully heal, but forests are patient. They operate on timescales that make human conflicts seem brief and insignificant. I grabbed a beer from the cooler beside my chair and raised it in a silent toast to the trees. They had been innocent victims in a human power struggle, but they would outlast all of us in the end. As darkness settled over the mountains, I heard the sound of an owl calling from deep in the forest. It was a sound I had not heard since before the power line project began. The wildlife was coming back. A car pulled up my driveway, and I recognized Richard's electric sedan. He got out carrying a six-pack and a folder. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he called out. "Not at all. What brings you by?" He climbed the porch steps and handed me the folder. "Thought you might want to see this. It is the HOA's annual report. First honest one we have had in years." I flipped through it while Richard grabbed a beer and sat down. The report showed that the HOA's finances were actually in better shape than anyone had realized. Brenda had been sitting on substantial reserves while crying poverty, probably planning to funnel that money into her own pockets through various schemes. "We are thinking about doing a community forest preservation initiative," Richard said, "setting aside some of the undeveloped land on the eastern edge as protected green space. After everything that happened with your property, people are more aware of how valuable these natural areas are." "That sounds great," I said sincerely. "We could use your expertise if you are willing to serve on the committee." I laughed. "After everything the HOA put me through, you want me to volunteer for them?" "It is a different HOA now. We are trying to do things right." He looked out at the forest. "And honestly, you are the one person in this community who proved they will stand up for what is right, no matter the cost. We need people like that involved." I thought about it for a moment. My first instinct was to refuse, to stay isolated on my property and have nothing to do with the HOA ever again. But Richard had a point. The organization had changed, and if I wanted to protect the natural areas in this region, getting involved was more effective than staying on the sidelines. "Let me think about it," I said. "That is all I ask." We sat in comfortable silence, drinking our beers and listening to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful, and for the first time in over a year, I felt like I could truly relax. "Can I ask you something?" Richard said after a while. "When things got really bad, when Brenda was threatening foreclosure and the legal fees were piling up, did you ever think about just giving up?" "Every day," I admitted. "There were nights I lay awake wondering if I was being stupid, if I should just take whatever settlement they offered and move on. The stress was incredible." "So why did not you?" I thought carefully about my answer, because I realized that what was happening was not just about me. If I let the HOA illegally seize part of my property, it would set a precedent. Brenda would have gotten away with her corruption. Other people would have suffered down the line. Sometimes you have to fight not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. Richard nodded slowly. "That is what I thought. That is why we need you involved in making sure this community does better going forward. Over the next few months, I did get involved with the HOA's Forest Preservation Committee. We worked with conservation groups to identify ecologically significant areas and drafted new rules to protect them. The HOA even allocated funds to purchase development rights on several key properties, ensuring they would remain forested in perpetuity. It was not the retirement I had envisioned when I first bought my cabin and land. I'd wanted isolation and peace, not community involvement and committee meetings. But I had to admit there was something satisfying about taking a bad situation and turning it into positive change. In September, the North Carolina Attorney General's office sent me a letter thanking me for bringing the HOA's misconduct to light. Apparently, my case had prompted them to look at other HOAs around the state, and they had found a pattern of similar abuses. New legislation was being drafted to increase oversight and transparency requirements for HOAs statewide. David called me when he heard about the legislation. "You started something bigger than you realized," he said. "That little forest of yours might end up protecting a lot more than just trees." "I just wanted to keep power lines off my property," I said. That is how most important legal precedents start. Someone just trying to protect what is theirs, and it ends up changing the whole system. By the end of that year, my forest was looking noticeably better. The restoration work was ahead of schedule, and the ecological surveys showed that biodiversity was already rebounding. I had even found a family of foxes denning near where the utility poles had been removed. On Christmas Eve, I hosted a small gathering at my cabin. Richard and his family came, along with David and a few other people who had supported me through the legal battle. We roasted marshmallows over a fire pit and told stories while snow began to fall on the forest. Richard's 10-year-old daughter, Maria, asked me about the power lines and why I had fought so hard to stop them. "Well," I said, crouching down to her level, "sometimes people try to do things that are not right, even if those people are in charge. When that happens, you have to be brave and stand up for what you believe in." "Were you scared?" she asked. "Terrified," I admitted. "But being brave does not mean you are not scared. It means you do the right thing even when you are scared." She seemed satisfied with that answer and ran off to play in the snow with her brother. David raised his beer. "To James Everhart, the man who took on an HOA and actually won." Everyone laughed and drank to the toast, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. These people had become my community, not because we lived in the same neighborhood or followed the same rules, but because we had fought together for something that mattered. As the guests left and I cleaned up, I thought about how much had changed in less than 2 years. When those contractors first showed up with their chainsaws, I had been a solitary person focused only on my own peace and quiet. The battle with the HOA had forced me to engage with the world in ways I had been avoiding. Was I happier now? That was hard to say. My forest was damaged but healing. My bank account was healthier thanks to the settlement, but I had spent countless hours and enormous emotional energy on the legal fight. I had made new friends, but also enemies. But I was definitely more connected. I understood my place in the community and my responsibility to it. I had learned that you cannot just isolate yourself and hope the world leaves you alone. Sometimes the world comes crashing through your forest with chainsaws and power lines, and you have to decide who you are and what you stand for. I walked out onto my porch one last time before bed. The snow was falling steadily now, covering the forest in white. In the moonlight, you could barely see the scars where the trees had been cut. Give it a few more years, and even those traces would disappear. But the legal precedents would remain. The HOA reforms would continue. The protected forest areas would expand. What had started as one man's fight to save his trees had rippled outward in ways I could never have anticipated. I thought about Brenda Patterson, probably living in some other state now, trying to rebuild her reputation. I did not hate her anymore. I almost felt sorry for her. She had been so focused on money and power and control that she had lost sight of basic decency and legality. In the end, her greed had destroyed her. The owl called again from the darkness, and I smiled. That sound was worth more than any recreation area or power line or HOA regulation. It was the sound of wilderness persisting despite humanity's constant encroachment. It was the sound of victory, quiet and patient and eternal. I went inside, locked the door, and went to bed. Tomorrow I would plant more trees. The day after, I had an HOA committee meeting to discuss new conservation easements. Life went on, different than I had planned, but meaningful in ways I had not expected. The forest would heal, the community would improve, and I would continue standing guard over this small piece of wilderness that had somehow become the center of everything that mattered to me. It had been a long fight, but it was worth it. Every tree, every dollar spent on legal fees, every sleepless night worrying about foreclosure, all of it had been worth it to protect this place and stand up for what was right. As I drifted off to sleep, I could still hear the wind moving through the pine trees, a sound that had existed long before power lines and HOAs and legal battles, and would continue long after all of us were gone. It was the sound of home.